It's been years since that day, but the memory still lingers in the back of my mind, like a shadow I can't quite escape. Back then, I lived in a quiet neighborhood, where everyone seemed to know each other. My neighbor, Mr. Callahan, was one of those people who always wore a warm smile, the kind you wouldn't question. He was polite, reserved, and lived alone in a quaint, well-kept house. Our interactions were always brief but friendly. Waves in the morning, the occasional chat about the weather. So, when he asked me to look after his house while he was away on a trip, I didn't think twice about saying yes. His instructions were simple. Keep an eye on the place, water the plants, and make sure everything was in order. He handed me a spare key and thanked me profusely before leaving. At the time, it felt like a straightforward favor, nothing out of the ordinary. For the first day, it was. The house was tidy, almost eerily so, with everything in its place. The only thing that stood out was a room at the end of the hallway, its door firmly shut. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a storage room or a guest bedroom. But that night, as I was getting ready to leave, I heard it, a faint noise coming from behind the closed door. It sounded like a soft creak, as if the floorboards were shifting under someone's weight. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, debating whether to open it. But something held me back, a feeling I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was probably nothing and left, locking the door behind me. The second night was different. The house seemed colder, quieter, as if it were holding its breath. I walked through the rooms, watering the plants and checking the locks, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. When I reached the end of the hallway, I stopped in front of the closed door. This time, the noise was clearer, a faint scratching sound, like nails scraping against wood. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the door. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that made my skin crawl. I decided to check the rest of the house, hoping to find some logical explanation for the noises. As I moved through the rooms, I noticed things I hadn't before. On a bookshelf in the living room, there were several old leather-bound books with strange symbols embossed on their spines. One of them lay open on the coffee table, its pages filled with handwritten notes in a language I didn't recognize. The air felt heavier now, and every creak of the floorboards under my feet made me jump. By the time I finished my rounds, I was eager to leave. But as I passed the closed door again on my way out, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside knew I was there. The third night, I couldn't resist anymore. The sounds behind the door were growing louder, scratches, faint murmurs, and what I swore sounded like a chair creaking as if someone were rocking back and forth. I knew I shouldn't, but curiosity was eating away at me. I spent the day turning the possibilities over in my mind. Maybe it was a draft, or perhaps an animal had somehow gotten trapped inside. But why hadn't Mr. Callahan mentioned anything about the room? By the time I arrived at the house that evening, I had made up my mind. I needed to see what was behind that door. The door was locked, just as it had been before. After searching the house, I finally found a key tucked away in a drawer in the kitchen. My hands trembled as I fitted into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit room. At first, it looked ordinary, a small desk, a chair, and shelves lining the walls. But as I stepped inside, the details began to emerge. The walls were covered in symbols, carved deep into the wood. Some were familiar, stars, circles, but others were jagged and alien, shapes that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. In the center of the room was a rocking chair, its paint peeling and the wood worn smooth. It moved gently back and forth, as if an invisible force was guiding it. My breath caught as I noticed the photos scattered across the desk. They were old, sepia-toned, and all of them featured the same man. He was tall, dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged to another era. His face was stern, almost lifeless, and he was always alone, staring directly at the camera. It wasn't Mr. Callahan. A sudden chill filled the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. The air seemed thicker now, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to leave, but something held me there, as if the room itself didn't want me to go. I stepped closer to the desk, picking up one of the photos. My fingers brushed against the glossy surface, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the man's expression change, a flicker of movement in his otherwise frozen face. I dropped the photo, and it landed face down on the desk. The rocking chair creaked louder now, its rhythm uneven, almost frantic. Then I heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The language was unfamiliar, but the intent was clear. I wasn't welcome here. The shadows in the room began to shift, pooling in the corners and stretching across the floor like liquid darkness. I backed toward the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the whispers. I turned and ran, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, the key slipping in my grasp. For a moment, the house was silent again. But as I stood there, trying to catch my breath, I felt it, a presence just on the other side of the door, waiting. I didn't go back to the house the following day. Whatever was in that room, whatever I had felt, it wasn't something I was prepared to face again. But there was no avoiding Mr. Callahan. He was scheduled to return that evening, and I knew I'd have to hand over the keys and pretend everything was normal. When he arrived, his demeanor was as friendly as ever. He greeted me with a warm smile and thanked me profusely for looking after the house. But as he stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was different. "Everything went smoothly?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp, as if searching for something in my expression. "Yes," I lied, my voice unsteady. "It was quiet. No problems at all." He nodded, his smile never wavering, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes, relief, maybe, or recognition. It was subtle, but it made my skin crawl. As we chatted, I noticed that he didn't ask any specific questions about the house, as if he already knew what had, or hadn't, happened. I handed him the keys and made my excuses to leave, my chest tightening with every passing moment. Before I could step out the door, he called out to me. "Thank you again for taking care of things," he said, his tone even. "And I hope you didn't go into any places you weren't supposed to." I froze, my back to him. The words were casual, almost offhand, but they carried a weight that made my stomach twist. I managed a weak laugh and mumbled something about respecting his privacy before leaving as quickly as I could. I didn't sleep that night, even in my own home, miles away from Mr. Callahan's house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The memories of that room, the chair, and those photos haunted me, replaying over and over in my mind. For weeks, I avoided Mr. Callahan. When I saw him in the neighborhood, I crossed the street or pretended not to notice him. He didn't seem to mind, or maybe he just didn't care. But the dreams began not long after. In them, I was back in that room, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. The rocking chair moved, its creak echoing in the silence. And always, the man from the photos was there, standing in the corner, watching me with those lifeless eyes. Even now, years later, I can't drive past that house without feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I never told anyone what I saw, not because I think they wouldn't believe me, but because I'm not sure I believe it myself. The last time I saw Mr. Callahan, he was standing in his yard, watching me as I walked by. He waved, his smile as warm as ever. But there was something in his eyes, something that reminded me of that man in the photos. I don't know what was in that room or why it was there. I only know this: some doors are meant to stay closed. And if you ever find yourself in a house that doesn't belong to you, resist the urge to explore. Because once you've seen what's inside, it might never let you go. I moved into my new house a few years ago, seeking a fresh start. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where you'd expect to hear birds chirping in the morning and children playing in the afternoons. My house was modest but cozy, exactly what I needed at the time. Across the street, there was a house that stood out. Unlike the others, it was always dark, with its curtains perpetually drawn. I didn't think much of it at first. Perhaps the owner was just private or rarely home. The neighbors I spoke to were vague when I asked about it, brushing it off as the quiet house. The first few nights in my new home were uneventful. I unpacked, settled in, and enjoyed the tranquility of my surroundings. But then, late one night, I noticed something unusual. From my living room window, I had a clear view of the dark house across the street. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a faint shadow passing behind the curtains. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light or my tired eyes. But the next night, I saw it again. It was around midnight when I saw the shadow again. This time, it was unmistakable. Something or someone was moving inside that house. The silhouette was faint, but its movements were deliberate, not random like the flickering of a curtain in the breeze. I leaned closer to the window, my heart beginning to race. There was no light in the house, only the faint glow from a distant street lamp casting shadows on the curtains. The figure moved again, and this time it stopped. It was standing still, right behind the curtain. For a moment, I felt as if it was looking directly at me. I froze, unsure of what to do. My rational mind told me it couldn't see me through my own darkened window, but the way it stood there, motionless, felt too intentional. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow shifted and disappeared deeper into the house. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and stepped away from the window. I told myself it was nothing, just a neighbor moving about in their own home. But something about the stillness, the darkness, didn't sit right with me. I tried to push the thought from my mind, but the image of that shadow lingered as I lay in bed that night, staring at my ceiling, unable to sleep. The following night, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow and how it seemed to be aware of me. I decided to keep watch, convincing myself that I was just being overly imaginative. Around the same time as the previous night, the movement began again. This time, I grabbed a pair of binoculars I'd brought with me during the move, left over from a bird-watching hobby I'd never really pursued. Through the lenses, the view became clearer but also more unnerving. The shadows inside weren't moving naturally. They stretched and warped, almost as if they were sliding along the walls rather than walking. Then I saw it, a tall, elongated figure standing in front of the window. Its outline was human-like, but something about it felt wrong. Its head tilted slightly, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it was looking directly at me. My hands trembled as I lowered the binoculars, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I turned off the lights in my room, hoping to blend into the darkness. When I dared to look again, the figure was gone. But the unease it left behind was suffocating. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying what I had seen. By morning, I convinced myself to let it go. Maybe it was just a neighbor who enjoyed walking around late at night. But deep down, I didn't believe it. That evening, I hesitated before approaching the window. A part of me didn't want to look, but my curiosity wouldn't let it go. Midnight came, and as if on cue, the shadows returned. This time, I didn't need the binoculars. The figure moved closer to the curtain, its form sharper, more distinct. My stomach turned when I realized something. This figure didn't cast a shadow on the curtain, it was the shadow. Then it happened. The figure moved past the window and out of sight, and I felt a chill run down my spine. A moment later, a faint creak echoed through the silence. It wasn't coming from the house across the street. It was coming from inside mine. The creaking sound echoed through the darkness of my house, freezing me in place. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the wind, or the house settling. But deep down, I knew better. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed the nearest object I could use as a weapon, a heavy flashlight, and crept toward the source of the noise. My heart pounded in my chest as I tiptoed down the hall, each step feeling like an eternity. The creaking came again, louder this time, as if something, or someone, was moving slowly through my living room. I peered around the corner, my breath caught in my throat. The front door was shut, but there was a figure standing in the middle of the room. It was the same shadowy form I had seen across the street, tall and distorted, its edges shifting unnaturally. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its attention fixed on me. I stepped back, and the floor creaked beneath me. The figure jerked its head in my direction, its movements sharp and unnatural. A guttural noise filled the air, low and resonant, like a voice that wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. Panic overtook me. I turned and ran toward the back door, fumbling with the lock as the sound of heavy, uneven footsteps closed in behind me. I managed to fling the door open and bolted into the night. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for air and clutching the stitch in my side. When I finally looked back, my house was dark and still, the same as always. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed at a nearby motel, pacing the room and replaying the events over and over in my mind. I knew I couldn't go back, not after what I had seen. The next morning, I made arrangements to leave. I packed what little I could fit in my car and didn't bother saying goodbye to the neighbors. As I drove away, I glanced at the house across the street one last time. The curtains were open. Inside, I could see the empty living room, untouched and eerily normal. For a moment, I doubted everything that had happened. Maybe it had all been in my head. But as I turned the corner, I caught a glimpse of something in the window. A shadowy figure, still and silent, watching me leave. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear the creak of my old floorboards, as if something followed me after all. It's been years since that strange period in my life, but the memories remain as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. Back then, I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves, exchanging polite nods but rarely delving into each other's lives. My neighbor was no exception, a reserved man named Mr. Harlan who seemed perfectly content living in his own little world. His house was ordinary, much like the others on the street, but something about it always seemed off to me. The windows were perpetually curtained, and I rarely saw him outside, except for brief trips to and from his car. I didn't think much of it at the time. Everyone has their quirks, after all. It wasn't until one late evening that I noticed something strange. From my living room window, I saw faint, flickering lights coming from his basement. At first, I assumed it was a reflection or a trick of the light. But the flickering continued, irregular and almost frantic, like someone was running experiments down there. I told myself it wasn't my business, and yet, I couldn't stop glancing out the window every so often. The lights flickered on and off for hours before finally going dark. I should have let it go. But something about those lights planted a seed of curiosity in my mind, one that would soon grow into something much darker. The next night, the lights were back. This time, I couldn't help myself. I turned off the lights in my living room and moved closer to the window, keeping out of sight. That's when I saw him. Mr. Harlan emerged from his back door, carrying something large and heavy, wrapped in what looked like a dark sheet. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he descended the stairs to his basement. My heart began to race as I watched him disappear into the flickering light. I told myself it must be something mundane. Furniture, maybe, or old equipment. But then, moments later, he came back up the stairs empty-handed, his face impassive. I kept watching, and then I saw it. The shape he had carried into the basement. It was moving. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I squinted into the dim light, I realized the movement wasn't random. The object, or whatever it was writhing, shifting as though trying to free itself. I stumbled back from the window, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more absurd than the last. I wanted to call someone, but who? What would I even say? The lights in his basement finally went out, leaving his house in complete darkness. I stood there in my living room, staring out the window, unable to shake the image of that writhing shape from my mind. The days that followed were uneventful, at least on the surface. I tried to convince myself that what I saw wasn't real, that it was just my imagination running wild. But every time I walked past Mr. Harlan's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't long before I started hearing strange sounds at night. Whispers, soft and indecipherable, coming from the direction of his basement. I tried to ignore them, chalking it up to the wind, the house settling, or perhaps my own nerves getting the best of me. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew clearer and more distinct, as if someone was speaking just below a whisper, trying to keep their words hidden. I began to hear the whispers in my own house, two soft, distant murmurs that seemed to come from the walls. I thought I was losing my mind. I had to know what was happening in that basement, but I also feared what I might find. So, one night, I decided to gather the courage to investigate further. It was just after midnight when I slipped out of my house and crossed the yard toward Mr. Harlan's. I kept to the shadows, feeling my heartbeat quicken with each step. As I approached his back door, I saw a faint glow coming from beneath it. The basement door was slightly ajar, as though inviting me in. I stood there for a moment, listening. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a profound silence. I pushed the door open quietly, the hinges creaking, and peered inside. The basement was dimly lit, the flickering light from a single bulb casting strange, shifting shadows against the walls. I hesitated before stepping inside, my breath shallow and quick. The air was heavy, thick with an unsettling stillness. The room was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, but there was something in the far corner that caught my attention. There, in the corner, was the same shape I had seen Mr. Harlan carry down, except now it was no longer wrapped in a sheet. It was a body, or at least what I thought was a body. It lay still on the floor, its pale skin unnaturally smooth and lifeless, but the way it was positioned, it didn't seem like it was just lying there. It was almost as if it was waiting. I backed away slowly, my mind spinning with fear. The silence around me felt suffocating, and I had the distinct feeling that someone, was watching me from the shadows. The floorboards creaked behind me, and I whipped around, only to find the basement empty. But the air had changed. I could feel something that wasn't right, pressing in on me. The whispers began again, faint but insistent, like voices calling from the darkness. I didn't wait to investigate further. I turned and ran out of the basement, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, my body trembling. I couldn't understand what I had just seen or heard, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that basement, it was not human. I couldn't stop shaking as I rushed back to my house. My mind was a whirlwind of terror, struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. I wanted to forget about it, to lock the memory away and never think about it again. But I couldn't. The whispers from the basement echoed in my ears, persistent and unsettling, and the image of that lifeless body, moving ever so slightly, haunted me. I spent the rest of the night pacing in my house, staring at the walls, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The whispers stopped, the silence returned, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy weight in my chest. I couldn't ignore what I had seen, no matter how hard I tried. I spent the day trying to act normal, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I avoided looking at Mr. Harlan's house, telling myself that it was just paranoia. But as the evening approached, my nerves grew more and more frayed. I couldn't keep my mind off the basement. That night, around the same time I had seen the lights flickering in his basement before, I noticed Mr. Harlan standing outside his house. His figure was silhouetted in the dim light of his porch, staring out into the street. I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I felt like I had to know more. As I walked towards him, my heart pounding in my chest, Mr. Harlan turned to face me. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Evening," he said, his voice calm and steady, but his tone held an odd weight to it, as if he knew something I didn't. I struggled to speak, unsure of what to say. I just wanted to check in. Make sure everything's all right, Mr. Harlan's smile was thin, almost amused. Everything's fine, just the usual. Work and all. But I do appreciate you keeping an eye on things for me. He paused, taking a step closer, and lowered his voice slightly. I trust you haven't been snooping around where you shouldn't, have you? My breath caught in my throat. I froze, my thoughts racing. Had he seen me? How could he know? No, I replied quickly, my voice sounding unconvincing even to me. I haven't. Just checking the yard, making sure everything's secure. Mr. Harlan nodded slowly, his smile never fading. Good. Because some things, well, they aren't meant to be seen. The tension in his words was unmistakable. It was as if he were warning me, not just about his house, but about something deeper, something darker that I was already entangled in. He gave me a knowing look before turning back toward the house. I stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, watching him disappear inside. A feeling of dread washed over me. I knew he was aware of what I had seen. But more than that, I felt something more sinister in his words, something I hadn't fully grasped yet. The next few days were a blur of tension and unease. I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Harlan's words, his strange, knowing look. I began to feel as though I were being drawn into something I didn't understand, something that was far beyond my control. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. The house, the basement, the whispers, they were all connected. And I had to find out what it all meant. I went back to his house. This time, I wasn't just watching from the window. I was going inside. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't keep living with the uncertainty. I approached the back door cautiously, every step feeling like it was leading me further into the unknown. As I reached for the doorknob, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. Just the darkened yard stretching out before me. With a steadying breath, I opened the door. It creaked as it swung inward, and I stepped inside, the air thick with the same heavy tension I had felt before. The house was silent. I made my way to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed it open and descended the stairs, my flashlight illuminating the way. The basement looked the same as before, but this time I was ready for whatever I would find. As I stepped further into the room, I saw it, the shape of something moving in the corner. The same lifeless body I had seen before, but now it was fully alive. Its eyes were wide open, and it was staring directly at me, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't speak, but its gaze sent a jolt of terror through my body. In that moment, I realized the truth. The man in the photos, the body on the floor, the strange happenings, it was all connected. Mr. Harlan was no ordinary neighbor. He was part of something much darker, something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, slamming the basement door behind me. My heart raced as I burst through the house and out into the night, never looking back. Even now, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed, if I had gone further into that house, into that mystery. But one thing is clear. Some secrets are better left uncovered. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.